They called her a seductress, a sorceress, a temptress who bent the most powerful men on earth to her will. For over 2,000 years, that image has survived almost untouched, whispered in classrooms, repeated in films, etched into popular memory. But what if that version of Cleopatra was carefully constructed? What if the most dangerous thing about her was not her beauty, but her intelligence? Here's the part history rarely tells you. Near the end of her life, Cleopatra made a decision so calculated, so politically charged, that even her enemies were forced to erase its true meaning. What that decision was, and why Rome feared it, will be revealed later in this documentary. For now, understand this. Cleopatra VII was not merely the last queen of Egypt. She was a strategist navigating a collapsing world order, a ruler fighting to preserve her kingdom while Rome swallowed the Mediterranean whole. She was born into a dynasty already rotting from within. Greek rulers sitting on an ancient Egyptian throne, hated by many of the people they governed and distrusted by the rising superpower to the west. By the time Cleopatra took her first breath, Egypt was no longer the center of the world it once had been. It was a prize waiting to be claimed. And yet, against impossible odds, Cleopatra refused to become a footnote. She learned languages others ignored. She mastered politics others feared. She understood that power was not inherited. It was seized, defended, and constantly renegotiated. Every alliance she formed, every risk she took, was made in a world where one misstep meant annihilation. This documentary is not about myth. It is about survival. It is about how a young woman rose to power in a male-dominated world, challenged the greatest empire of antiquity, and left behind a legacy so powerful that history itself felt threatened by it. If you want to understand the ancient world beyond the stories we were taught, if you want to uncover the truth beneath the legend, make sure you subscribe to Ancient Odyssey. This is where the past speaks for itself. Now, to understand Cleopatra's rise, we must first step back into an Egypt already standing at the edge of collapse. Egypt had once been the envy of the ancient world, a land where the Nile guaranteed life, wealth, and stability when other civilizations struggled against drought and famine. For thousands of years, pharaohs ruled with an authority believed to be divinely ordained, their power reinforced by tradition, religion, and control of one of the most productive river systems on Earth. But by the time Cleopatra was born, that ancient certainty had already begun to unravel. Foreign rule was no longer a temporary interruption, it had become the norm. Since the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great, the land of the pharaohs had been governed not by native dynasties, but by Macedonian Greeks who adopted Egyptian titles while ruling as outsiders. These kings spoke Greek, lived apart from the population, and treated Egypt less as a homeland and more as a resource to be managed and exploited. The throne still existed, but its foundations were cracking. Economic strain weighed heavily on the kingdom. Heavy taxation fed royal luxuries and constant court intrigue, while much of the population lived under increasing pressure. Grain exports enriched the elite, but left Egypt vulnerable to shortages, corruption, and unrest. The wealth of the Nile, once a blessing, had become a bargaining chip in international politics. At the same time, Egypt's independence was slowly being stripped away. Rome did not yet rule Egypt outright, but its shadow loomed large. Roman generals decided which kings stayed in power and which were removed. Debts to Rome mounted, and Roman protection came at the cost of sovereignty. Egypt was no longer shaping the Mediterranean, it was being shaped by it. Within the royal palace, instability was constant. Ptolemaic rulers assassinated siblings, married close relatives to preserve bloodlines, and eliminated rivals without hesitation. The throne was not passed down peacefully, it was seized, defended, and often drenched in blood. By the final decades of the dynasty, paranoia had replaced confidence, and survival mattered more than legitimacy. This was the Egypt Cleopatra inherited. Not a golden age, but a fragile kingdom balancing on the edge of irrelevance. The world she entered was one where a single wrong decision could end a dynasty that had already lasted nearly 3 centuries. And into this crumbling system, a child was born who would refuse to accept decline as destiny. To understand how she did that, we must begin at the moment her story truly starts, with her birth into a house already tearing itself apart. The rulers who sat on Egypt's throne in Cleopatra's time were pharaohs in title, but Greeks by blood, language, and culture. Their story began not in the Nile Valley, but on the battlefields carved open by Alexander the Great. When Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was welcomed as a liberator. But his empire fractured almost immediately after his death, and Egypt fell to one of his generals, Ptolemy, son of Lagus. From that moment on, Egypt belonged to a foreign dynasty that would rule it for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemies were pragmatic conquerors. They adopted the symbols of Egyptian kingship, built temples to Egyptian gods, and presented themselves as pharaohs chosen by tradition. Yet beneath the surface, they ruled as Hellenistic monarchs. Greek was the language of government and the court. Alexandria, not Memphis or Thebes, became the beating heart of the kingdom, a cosmopolitan city facing the Mediterranean rather than the Nile. The rulers lived among marble palaces, libraries, and theaters, while much of Egypt remained culturally and politically distant from them. This separation bred resentment and instability. The Ptolemies relied on a small Greek elite to govern a vast Egyptian population, creating sharp social divisions. Revolts erupted periodically, especially in Upper Egypt, where loyalty to foreign kings was thin. Power was maintained not through unity, but through force, wealth, and constant maneuvering. Nowhere was this instability more visible than inside the royal family itself. The Ptolemies perfected a brutal tradition of dynastic violence. Brothers married sisters to preserve royal blood, but they also murdered those same siblings when power was threatened. Sons overthrew fathers. Mothers poisoned children. The royal court became a place where trust was a liability and survival demanded cruelty. By Cleopatra's generation, this behavior was no longer shocking, it was expected. Yet despite the bloodshed, the dynasty endured because Egypt was simply too valuable to ignore. Its grain-fed cities across the Mediterranean, its wealth-financed wars and bought alliances, and Rome, growing ever stronger, understood this better than anyone. The Ptolemies remained kings only as long as Rome found them useful, or at least tolerable. By the time Cleopatra's father took the throne, the dynasty was exhausted. Its authority was hollow, its legitimacy questioned, and its future increasingly dependent on Roman approval. Cleopatra would be born not into stability, but into a family already at war with itself, ruling a land that no longer truly belonged to them. And it was within this volatile household, defined by fear, ambition, and constant danger, that Cleopatra VII entered the world. Cleopatra was born into a palace where survival mattered more than affection, and loyalty could vanish overnight. Around 69 BCE, as Egypt's royal court buzzed with intrigue, the arrival of a new princess was less a celebration and more a calculation. She was one child among many, born into a dynasty where birth alone meant nothing unless it could be turned into power. Her father, Ptolemy XII, ruled uneasily. He was unpopular, widely mocked, and deeply dependent on Rome's favor to keep his throne. His reign was marked by debt, bribery, and fear of rebellion from his own people, and fear of intervention from Roman generals who increasingly treated Egypt like a client state. Cleopatra entered the world at a moment when her family's grip on power was already slipping. The palace she grew up in was a place of whispers and watchful eyes. Courtiers aligned themselves with factions. Siblings were not companions, but potential rivals. Children were raised with the unspoken understanding that some of them would not survive to adulthood. The lessons of power were not taught gently, they were absorbed through observation, through disappearances, executions, and sudden shifts in favor. Yet Cleopatra's early life also placed her at the center of one of the most extraordinary cities in the ancient world. Alexandria was a crossroads of cultures, knowledge, and ambition. Scholars debated philosophy near the Great Library. Merchants brought goods from across Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Ideas flowed as freely as wealth. Unlike many of her ancestors, Cleopatra would not grow up insulated from the world. She would grow up studying it. From a young age, she was surrounded by contradictions. She was Egyptian royalty who ruled as a Greek. A princess in a kingdom rich beyond measure, yet politically fragile. A child in a family where power was inherited, but never secure. These tensions would shape her in ways that would later set her apart from every ruler who came before her. Because while other royal children were raised to enjoy power, Cleopatra was being prepared, consciously or not, to fight for it. And the weapon that would define her rise was not inherited authority or military force, but something far more dangerous in a collapsing world: knowledge. Cleopatra's greatest advantage was forged long before she ever wore a crown. In a dynasty obsessed with bloodlines and brute control, her education became her quiet rebellion. While many of her predecessors relied on generals, advisors, or Roman patrons to think for them, Cleopatra learned to think for herself. From an early age, she was immersed in the intellectual heart of Alexandria. This was not a ceremonial education designed to impress. It was rigorous, strategic, and deeply practical. She studied history not as stories of the past, but as case studies in power gained and lost. Philosophy sharpened her ability to reason. Rhetoric trained her to persuade. Mathematics and astronomy taught her to see patterns where others saw chaos. Medicine and natural science grounded her in the physical realities of life and death. Most remarkably, Cleopatra learned languages. While previous Ptolemies refused even to speak the tongue of the people they ruled, Cleopatra did the unthinkable. She learned Egyptian. It was a deliberate political choice, one that allowed her to communicate directly with priests, officials, and common people without intermediaries. Beyond that, she spoke Greek, Latin, and several other regional languages, enabling her to negotiate personally with foreign envoys and tribal leaders. In a world where translation could distort meaning or be weaponized, this made her dangerous. But education alone does not create power. Cleopatra also learned restraint. She watched her father placate Rome with bribes, then lose respect anyway. She observed how fear ruled the palace and how impatience destroyed those who moved too quickly. Every failure around her became a lesson she stored away. This was not the education of a philosopher detached from reality. It was the training of a political survivor. Cleopatra learned how narratives were shaped, how appearances could conceal intentions, and how timing mattered as much as action. By the time she reached adulthood, she understood that knowledge was not neutral, it was leverage. And when the moment came for her to step into the ruthless world of Ptolemaic politics, Cleopatra would do so not as a passive heir, but as someone already prepared for war. One fought not with armies at first, but with words, symbols, and strategy. That moment arrived sooner than she expected, when the fragile reign of her father finally came to an end. When Cleopatra took the throne, she was barely 18 years old, but the world she inherited left no room for youth or hesitation. Her father's death did not bring stability. It opened the gates to chaos. According to tradition, Cleopatra was crowned alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as co-rulers of Egypt. On paper, this arrangement preserved dynastic custom. In reality, it guaranteed conflict. The court quickly revealed where true power lay. Ptolemy XIII was a child, but those around him were not. Advisors, generals, and courtiers moved swiftly to sideline Cleopatra, seeing her not as a partner in rule, but as a threat. Her name disappeared from official documents. Coins were struck bearing only her brother's image. The message was unmistakable. Cleopatra was meant to be controlled or removed. She refused to disappear. Unlike many before her, Cleopatra did not retreat into ceremony. She asserted herself publicly, issuing decrees in her own name and presenting herself as the legitimate ruler of Egypt. She aligned herself with the priesthood and embraced Egyptian traditions more fully than any Ptolemy before her, understanding that popular support could counter palace intrigue. For a brief moment, it appeared as though she might succeed, but the forces against her were ruthless. Within a year, Cleopatra was pushed out of Alexandria, stripped of authority, and declared an enemy of the state. The same dynasty that had placed her on the throne now turned against her without hesitation. She fled eastward, away from the capital, into exile. For many rulers, this would have been the end. A young queen, without an army, without a palace, and without Rome's blessing, had little chance of survival. But exile did not weaken Cleopatra. It clarified her purpose. She began to gather allies, raise forces, and plan her return. She understood something her enemies did not. Egypt was valuable, but legitimacy was fragile. And fate, as it often did in the ancient world, was about to intervene, carried on the arrival of Rome's most powerful man. Egypt was now split, not by borders but by blood. Cleopatra's exile did not bring peace to the kingdom. It exposed how fragile the arrangement of shared rule had always been. With Cleopatra gone from Alexandria, Ptolemy XIII's advisors tightened their grip, ruling in his name while presenting the illusion of stability. But beneath the surface, Egypt was unraveling. The people were divided in their loyalties. Many resented the boy king and the men who spoke for him, seeing them as symbols of a corrupt court manipulated by self-interest. Others feared instability more than injustice and accepted the new order reluctantly. Meanwhile, Cleopatra gathered supporters beyond the capital, building an alternative claim to the throne that refused to fade quietly. What made this struggle especially dangerous was its intimacy. This was not a war between strangers, it was a family tearing itself apart in public view. Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII were bound by blood, law, and tradition, yet driven by survival to oppose one another. Each side accused the other of illegitimacy, betrayal, and treason. Every proclamation was an attempt to rewrite reality. Behind the scenes, betrayal became a currency. Advisors shifted allegiances. Generals weighed their options. Loyalty was sold to whoever promised security, wealth, or Roman favor. Even within Cleopatra's own camp, trust was fragile. She knew better than anyone that alliances formed in desperation could fracture just as quickly. As tensions escalated, Egypt drifted closer to open civil war. Two rulers claimed the same throne, and neither could afford to lose. But the decisive factor was no longer Egypt itself. The real judge of this conflict lay far beyond the Nile, in the hands of Rome. Because Rome did not tolerate instability in lands it depended upon, and Egypt's grain, vital to feeding Roman cities, made this family feud more than a domestic crisis. It made it a strategic problem. Soon, Roman legions would arrive not as guests, but as arbiters of Egypt's fate. And Cleopatra, watching from the margins, understood the truth before anyone else. Whoever controlled Rome's attention would control Egypt. That realization would soon lead her to the most daring gamble of her life. Cleopatra's fall from power was swift, humiliating, and potentially fatal. Stripped of her title and forced out of Alexandria, she became a queen without a kingdom, a ruler reduced to a fugitive. The palaces, the rituals, the authority she had fought to assert, all vanished almost overnight. In their place came uncertainty, danger, and the constant threat of assassination. She fled eastward, beyond the immediate reach of her brother's court, into territories where loyalty was uncertain and protection had to be earned. Here, Cleopatra confronted a reality few monarchs ever truly experience: survival without power. Every decision now carried personal risk. Every alliance had to be tested. There were no guarantees that tomorrow would come. Yet exile did not break her. It sharpened her. Instead of retreating into despair, Cleopatra began rebuilding from nothing. She gathered mercenaries, courted regional leaders, and quietly assembled an army, not large enough to conquer Egypt outright, but sufficient to make her impossible to ignore. She framed her cause not as rebellion, but as restoration. She was not seeking power, she insisted. She was reclaiming what had been stolen. This period transformed her. Away from the court's illusions, Cleopatra learned how quickly authority dissolves when fear replaces loyalty. She witnessed how ordinary people viewed the throne, not as a sacred institution, but as a distant force that could crush them without warning. These lessons would later shape the way she ruled, and the way she presented herself to Egypt. Meanwhile, back in Alexandria, Ptolemy XIII's regime struggled to maintain control. His advisors underestimated Cleopatra's resolve and overestimated their own security. Civil war loomed, and neither side could strike decisively without outside support. Egypt stood paralyzed, waiting for a power greater than itself to intervene. That power was already on its way. As Cleopatra maneuvered in exile, Roman ships approached Egyptian shores, carrying a man whose arrival would alter the course of her life and the fate of the ancient world. His name commanded fear, loyalty, and absolute authority. And Cleopatra understood that if she was to reclaim her throne, she would have to do something no one expected. Rome did not arrive in Egypt as a guest. It arrived as a force of gravity, unstoppable, reshaping everything in its pull. By the 1st century BCE, Rome was no longer just another Mediterranean power. It was the power. Kingdoms survived at its pleasure, fell at its command, or were quietly absorbed under the promise of protection. Egypt understood this reality all too well. Its grain fed Rome's swelling population. Its wealth stabilized Roman politics during times of unrest. To Rome, Egypt was not a sovereign kingdom. It was a strategic asset waiting to be secured. And instability within Egypt was something Rome simply would not tolerate. The man who brought Rome directly into Egypt's civil war was Julius Caesar. Fresh from victory in his own brutal struggle for control of Rome, Caesar pursued his defeated rival across the Mediterranean. That pursuit led him to Alexandria, where he walked straight into a dynastic conflict he did not create, but would soon dominate. Both sides in Egypt's civil war understood what Caesar's presence meant. Ptolemy XIII's court rushed to secure Roman favor, believing that legitimacy flowed not from the people or tradition, but from Rome's approval. Cleopatra, watching from exile, reached the same conclusion, but drew a far more dangerous insight from it. Rome would decide Egypt's fate, but Rome itself could be influenced. Caesar did not come seeking to rule Egypt directly. He came to stabilize it on Rome's terms. He demanded repayment of Egypt's debts, obedience to Roman authority, and an end to the chaos threatening Rome's food supply. To him, Egypt's internal struggle was a problem to be managed, not a tragedy to be mourned. Alexandria, however, was not easily controlled. Tensions erupted almost immediately. Riots broke out. Factions clashed. Roman soldiers found themselves surrounded by a city that resisted foreign authority as fiercely as it feared it. What Caesar had intended as a brief intervention began to turn into a crisis. And somewhere beyond the city, a young queen weighed her options. Cleopatra knew she could not defeat Rome. She also knew that Rome did not fully understand her. Power, she realized, did not always belong to the largest army. It belonged to the one who controlled the narrative, the moment, and the man at the center of it all. What she chose to do next would become one of the most famous encounters in ancient history. Not because it was romantic, but because it was calculated to perfection. Cleopatra understood that armies could be rebuilt, alliances repaired, and even exile endured, but opportunities like this appeared once in a lifetime. Rome's most powerful man was inside Alexandria, surrounded by enemies, struggling to impose order on a kingdom that refused to be simple. Cleopatra did not see a conqueror. She saw a pressure point. She also knew she could not approach him openly. Her brother's forces controlled the city. Her name alone was enough to provoke arrest or execution. If she wanted to be heard, she would have to bypass armies, gates, and expectations entirely. So she took a risk so extreme that even failure would have ended her life. Under the cover of night, Cleopatra slipped into Alexandria, smuggled past guards loyal to her enemies. She entered Caesar's quarters not as a queen with an army, but as a ruler stripped of everything except her claim and her mind. The act itself was theater, but the purpose was precise. She forced a confrontation where none was supposed to happen. She made herself impossible to ignore. What followed was not seduction in the way later storytellers would portray it. It was negotiation. Cleopatra spoke as a monarch defending her legitimacy, exposing the corruption of her brother's advisors, and presenting herself as the only ruler capable of stabilizing Egypt in Rome's interest. She did not beg. She argued. She calculated. She reframed Egypt's civil war as a problem only she could solve. Caesar listened. He saw what others had missed. Cleopatra was not a liability. She was an asset. She understood Egypt, commanded loyalty beyond the palace walls, and possessed a political awareness rare even among Roman elites. Supporting her offered Rome stability without occupation, control without administration. That night, Cleopatra changed her fate. By dawn, the balance of power in Egypt had shifted. Caesar placed himself squarely between the warring siblings, declaring that Rome would arbitrate the conflict. But in practice, his support was already leaning toward Cleopatra. Her enemies sensed it immediately and reacted with fury. Alexandria erupted. What had begun as a calculated meeting spiraled into open conflict that would engulf the city in violence and fire. Cleopatra had won Caesar's attention, but the cost of that victory was about to become devastating. The gamble had worked. Now came the consequences. The story would later be reduced to a single image, a queen unrolled from a carpet, unveiled before Rome's greatest general. It was scandalous, theatrical, irresistible to storytellers, and dangerously misleading. Because what happened in Alexandria was not a romantic stunt. It was political theater, executed with precision. The dramatic entrance was not about surprise for its own sake. It was a message. Cleopatra did not arrive with guards, proclamations, or demands. She arrived alone, vulnerable by appearance but powerful in implication. By entering Caesar's presence in that way, she shattered protocol and seized control of the moment. No intermediaries. No distortions. No delay. In a city ruled by factions and manipulation, she forced a direct encounter. Later Roman writers would linger on the spectacle, reshaping it to fit their own anxieties about powerful women and foreign queens. The emphasis on seduction served a purpose. It diminished her intellect and reframed strategy as temptation. But stripped of myth, the reality is far more revealing. Cleopatra used symbolism the way Rome used legions. She understood that power often begins with perception. Inside that room, the conversation was sober and urgent. Egypt was collapsing into civil war. Rome's interests were at risk. Caesar needed stability, not chaos. Cleopatra offered a solution grounded in legitimacy, experience, and control over the population her brother could not command. She positioned herself not as a lover, but as a ruler with leverage. The impact was immediate. Caesar's decision to support arbitration, rather than simply back the existing regime, was a public acknowledgement that Cleopatra mattered. For her enemies, this was unforgivable. What they had dismissed as a publicity stunt now threatened their hold on power. Violence in Alexandria intensified, dragging Roman troops into street fighting they had not anticipated. The city itself became a battleground. Fires spread. Districts fell into chaos. At one point, even Caesar's own safety was in doubt. And through it all, Cleopatra remained close, not hidden, not passive, but present. She had tied her fate to Rome's most dangerous man, knowing that if he fell, she would fall with him. The so-called carpet scene endured because it was convenient. It reduced a calculated political maneuver into a sensational anecdote. But the truth is far more unsettling for history's traditional narratives. Cleopatra did not charm her way into power. She engineered it. And with Rome now entangled in Egypt's civil war, there would be no turning back for anyone. Cleopatra did not reclaim her throne through ceremony or inheritance. She reclaimed it through war. With Caesar now committed to resolving Egypt's crisis, the conflict escalated beyond palace intrigue into open, brutal fighting. Alexandria became a city under siege, its streets choked with violence as Roman soldiers and Egyptian forces clashed for control. Ptolemy XIII's advisors underestimated both Cleopatra's resolve and Caesar's willingness to intervene decisively. What they believed would be a brief show of force turned into a prolonged struggle. Supplies ran low. Morale fractured. The city that had once symbolized learning and prosperity now burned under the weight of ambition and fear. When the fighting finally ended, the result was irreversible. Ptolemy XIII was dead, his rule extinguished in the chaos he helped unleash. With his fall, the last serious internal challenge to Cleopatra's authority collapsed. Egypt no longer had competing claimants. It had a single, undisputed ruler. Cleopatra was restored to the throne, this time not as a sidelined co-ruler, but as the dominant force in Egypt's government. Rome had made its choice. Caesar confirmed her position, binding her rule to Roman interests while allowing her to govern Egypt as a client kingdom rather than a conquered province. It was a delicate balance, and Cleopatra understood it perfectly. To satisfy tradition and stabilize the court, she was paired with another younger brother as a nominal co-ruler. But unlike before, the illusion of shared power was just that, an illusion. Real authority rested firmly with Cleopatra. She controlled policy, diplomacy, and the narrative of her own reign. This restoration marked a turning point. Cleopatra was no longer reacting to events, she was shaping them. She presented herself as both pharaoh and protector, blending Egyptian religious authority with Hellenistic political skill. To her people, she was a stabilizing force after years of chaos. To Rome, she was a necessary partner. But restoration came with consequences. Cleopatra's survival was now inseparable from Rome's internal struggles. Her future, and Egypt's, would rise or fall with the men who controlled the Republic. And one consequence of her alliance with Caesar would soon redefine her legacy in a way no military victory ever could. Cleopatra's restoration to power did not mark the end of her gamble with Rome, it deepened it. In the aftermath of war and political upheaval, a child was born whose existence carried consequences far beyond the walls of the Egyptian palace. His name was Ptolemy the 15th Philopator Philometor Caesar. History would remember him simply as Caesarion, which means Little Caesar. For Cleopatra, this child was more than a son. He was a statement. By acknowledging Caesarion as the offspring of Rome's most powerful man, Cleopatra anchored her rule to something unprecedented: blood ties to Rome itself. In a world where legitimacy often flowed through lineage, Caesarion represented a future in which Egypt was not merely a client kingdom, but a partner bound to Rome by dynasty rather than force. Cleopatra did not hide him. She elevated him. Coins were minted. Titles were bestowed. He was presented not just as a prince of Egypt, but as the heir to a legacy that stretched beyond the Nile. This was a calculated move, and Cleopatra understood exactly how dangerous it was. In Rome, the implications were explosive. The Republic was already strained by civil war, ambition, and fear of monarchy. The idea that a foreign queen had borne a son who could claim descent from Rome's most dominant figure threatened the fragile balance of power. Supporters downplayed the child's significance. Enemies mocked or denied his legitimacy outright. Silence became a political tool. Cleopatra, however, was thinking long-term. Caesarion secured her position within Egypt by reinforcing her image as a living goddess queen, mother to a divinely favored heir. At the same time, he offered a vision of continuity, a future in which Egypt would not simply survive Rome, but be woven into its ruling bloodline. Yet this vision depended entirely on one man's survival. As Rome's internal tensions sharpened, Cleopatra watched events unfold from a distance, fully aware that her fate, and her son's, rested on forces she could not control. When news finally reached Egypt that shook the Roman world to its core, Cleopatra understood instantly what it meant. Her protector was gone, and the future she had begun to build was suddenly in peril. The news reached Egypt like a thunderclap. Julius Caesar was dead, assassinated in the heart of Rome by men who claimed to be saving the Republic. For Cleopatra, the meaning was immediate and terrifying. The man who had secured her throne, protected her reign, and anchored her son's future was gone in an instant. Caesar's death did not simply remove a political ally. It collapsed the fragile structure that had allowed Cleopatra to rule with Roman support. Overnight, the balance of power shifted. Rome descended into chaos once again, and in times of Roman chaos, foreign queens were liabilities. Cleopatra had been in Rome not long before, navigating its dangerous politics, observing firsthand how deeply Caesar's enemies resented both his authority and the symbols of monarchy surrounding him. She understood that his assassination was not just about tyranny, it was about fear. Fear of kings, fear of dynasties, fear of exactly what Caesarion represented. With Caesar gone, Cleopatra acted swiftly. She returned to Egypt, distancing herself from Rome's internal violence while consolidating power at home. Any illusion that Caesarion might be openly acknowledged as Caesar's heir evaporated. In Rome, his name became inconvenient, even dangerous to speak. Cleopatra was no longer just a queen fighting for a throne. She was a mother protecting a son whose very existence challenged Rome's future. Cleopatra had faced exile before, but this was different. She was no longer a young queen fighting for recognition. She was an experienced ruler, hardened by war and loss, suddenly stripped of her greatest protection. With Caesar gone, Egypt stood exposed. In Rome, chaos reigned. Power shifted between ambitious men who spoke of restoring the Republic while carving it into pieces for themselves. None of them owed Cleopatra loyalty. Some viewed her as a reminder of Caesar's overreach, others as a potential threat, and many as a prize waiting to be claimed. Silence from Rome was not reassurance, it was a warning. Cleopatra responded by turning inward. She strengthened Egypt's economy, secured grain supplies, and reinforced her authority over the priesthood and bureaucracy. Stability became her shield. Egypt had to appear calm, prosperous, and indispensable, even as uncertainty loomed beyond its borders. At the same time, she worked to erase vulnerabilities. Internal rivals were removed. Court factions were neutralized. Cleopatra understood that Rome did not need a reason to intervene. Disorder alone was enough. Egypt would not give Rome that excuse. Yet despite her efforts, Cleopatra could not remain isolated forever. Rome's civil wars would inevitably spill outward, and Egypt's resources made it impossible to ignore. The question was not whether Rome would return, but who would arrive, and under what terms. As the dust of Caesar's assassination settled, a new power structure began to emerge. Three men would divide Rome's world among themselves, each hungry for dominance, each seeking legitimacy through conquest, wealth, or alliance. One of them would look to the east, and see Cleopatra not as a liability, but as an opportunity. The man who now turned his attention toward Egypt was nothing like Caesar. Where Caesar was controlled and calculating, Mark Antony was emotional, theatrical, and driven by loyalty as much as ambition. He was a soldier's general, beloved by his men, feared by his enemies, and deeply aware that power in Rome now depended on securing allies beyond its borders. Antony needed the East. He needed money, grain, ships, and legitimacy. Egypt offered all of it. Cleopatra understood this immediately. When Antony summoned her to meet him, She did not arrive as a supplicant seeking protection. She arrived as a ruler meeting an equal. The setting, the timing, the display, none of it was accidental. Cleopatra presented Egypt not as a weakened client state, but as a kingdom that had survived Rome's chaos and emerged intact. Their alliance formed quickly, but it was built on mutual necessity rather than impulse. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his campaigns and secure his position against his rivals in Rome. Cleopatra needed a powerful Roman partner who could guarantee her throne and protect her children's future. Each saw in the other not romance first, but advantage. Yet unlike Caesar, Antony was drawn fully into Cleopatra's world. He stayed in Alexandria, immersed himself in its culture, and ruled alongside her in ways that unsettled Rome. To Roman observers, this was dangerous. Antony appeared to be drifting away from Roman tradition, embracing the luxury and symbolism of monarchy that the Republic claimed to despise. Cleopatra, meanwhile, expanded her influence. Territories were granted. Alliances strengthened. Her children were elevated in status, their futures carefully mapped across the eastern Mediterranean. What she was building was not merely a kingdom, it was a counterweight to Rome itself. But power displayed invites scrutiny. In Rome, Antony's enemies seized upon every rumor, every image of excess, every suggestion that a foreign queen had ensnared one of Rome's leaders. The narrative hardened quickly. Cleopatra was no longer a ruler negotiating survival. She was a threat to Roman identity. The alliance that had strengthened both Antony and Cleopatra was now becoming a liability. Rome would not tolerate the idea of a rival center of power, especially one led by a queen who understood its weaknesses too well. The moment was approaching when whispers would turn into accusations, and accusations into war. What happened next was not a private alliance. It was a public statement, and Rome understood it as a challenge. In a carefully staged ceremony in Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony did something unprecedented. They did not merely rule, they declared a vision of power that extended far beyond Egypt's borders. Territories across the eastern Mediterranean were redistributed, not by the Roman Senate, but by Antony, standing beside Cleopatra. Lands were assigned to her children. Titles were granted. Caesarion was elevated above all others, presented not just as a king, but as the rightful heir to a legacy Rome preferred to forget. The message was unmistakable. A new dynastic order was being announced, centered not in Rome, but in Alexandria. This moment became known as the Donations of Alexandria, and to Roman eyes, it was unforgivable. From Cleopatra's perspective, it was logical. Egypt's security depended on clear succession and visible strength. By tying her children to real territories and public authority, she reinforced their legitimacy and her own. She was building continuity in a world addicted to instability. Antony saw it differently, but not incompatibly. He was asserting control over Rome's eastern sphere, rewarding loyalty, and projecting dominance in a way the fractured Roman Republic could no longer manage. Together, they were doing what Rome claimed to oppose, yet increasingly practiced: monarchy. But symbolism matters more than intent. In Rome, this ceremony was framed as betrayal. Antony was accused of abandoning Roman values, surrendering Roman lands to a foreign queen, and preparing to move the center of power eastward. Cleopatra was painted as the mastermind, an outsider who sought to rule Romans through manipulation and excess. The reality was far more threatening than the propaganda suggested. Cleopatra and Antony were not dismantling Rome. They were exposing its weakness. They demonstrated that Rome's power depended on cooperation from the very kingdoms it sought to dominate. Rome would not forgive that. The donations transformed a political rivalry into an existential conflict. This was no longer about alliances or influence. It was about whether Rome would remain the undisputed center of the world, or whether a queen in Egypt had dared to imagine something else. From that moment on, war was inevitable. Rome did not declare war immediately. It prepared the ground first, because Rome understood something as well as Cleopatra did. Battles are often won long before armies move. And in this phase of the conflict, words were the weapons. At the center of the storm stood Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. Where Antony ruled through presence and loyalty, Octavian ruled through image and narrative. He did not need to defeat Cleopatra on the battlefield yet. He needed to define her in the Roman imagination. The campaign was relentless. Antony was portrayed as weak, corrupted, and no longer Roman. Cleopatra was cast as the true enemy, a foreign queen who had ensnared a Roman general and now sought to rule Rome through him. Every excess in Alexandria was exaggerated. Every gesture of Eastern kingship was framed as treason. The donations of Alexandria were recast not as political theater, but as proof that Antony had surrendered Roman power to a woman. This framing was deliberate. Rome was deeply uncomfortable with monarchy, and even more uncomfortable with powerful women. By making Cleopatra the face of the conflict, Octavian transformed a civil war into something far more acceptable, a defensive struggle against an external threat. Rome would not be fighting Antony. It would be defending itself against a queen. Cleopatra understood what was happening, but countering Roman propaganda from Egypt was nearly impossible. Rome controlled the Senate, the courts, and the public voice. Truth mattered less than repetition. Over time, perception hardened into belief. Antony tried to respond, but he was outmatched. His absence from Rome allowed Octavian to dominate the narrative unchallenged. Each delay weakened Antony's standing and strengthened Octavian's claim that he alone represented Roman values and stability. Eventually, the Senate took the final step. War was declared, not against Antony, but against Cleopatra. It was a masterstroke. Antony was stripped of legitimacy, reduced to a follower, while Cleopatra was elevated as Rome's official enemy. The conflict was no longer a political rivalry. It was destiny. Cleopatra now faced the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known, not just on the battlefield, but in the realm of memory itself. And the confrontation everyone had tried to delay was finally unavoidable. The fate of Cleopatra's vision would be decided not in Egypt or Rome, but off the western coast of Greece, where two worlds collided at sea. By the time the opposing fleets faced one another near Actium, this was no longer simply a military confrontation. It was a referendum on the future of power itself. Cleopatra and Antony commanded a vast force, rich in resources and numbers, but divided in spirit. Their fleet was larger, heavier, and built for intimidation. It reflected the kind of empire they envisioned, grand, symbolic, and centralized. Opposing them was a leaner, more disciplined Roman force shaped by years of internal warfare, led by men who understood that endurance often mattered more than spectacle. The battle unfolded slowly, painfully. Wind, hesitation, and miscommunication plagued the alliance. Cleopatra's ships, carrying Egypt's treasury and her future, stayed positioned behind the main line. Antony hesitated, torn between strategy and instinct. As hours dragged on, momentum slipped away. Then came the moment that history would later simplify and misunderstand. Cleopatra ordered her fleet to break away and retreat. To Roman propagandists, this would become proof of cowardice or betrayal. To later historians, a mystery. But in context, it was a calculated act of survival. Cleopatra recognized that defeat was inevitable and chose preservation over annihilation. An empire can be rebuilt from retreat. It cannot be rebuilt from extinction. Antony followed her. That single decision shattered their remaining cohesion. What might have ended as a negotiated defeat became a decisive collapse. The Roman fleet pressed its advantage. Actium was lost, not in a dramatic final clash, but in a slow realization that the future had slipped out of reach. With Actium, the dream of an Eastern empire died. Not because it was impossible, but because Rome would not allow an alternative center of gravity to exist. Cleopatra and Antony retreated to Egypt, carrying with them the knowledge that time was now their enemy. Rome would not negotiate. It would pursue. And Cleopatra, once again, prepared for a final stand, knowing that this time there would be no return from exile. Defeat did not arrive in Egypt as a sudden collapse. It crept in slowly, carried by silence, broken alliances, and the knowledge that Rome's patience had ended. After Actium, Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria not as conquerors, but as rulers waiting for the inevitable. Hope narrowed to calculation. Cleopatra explored every remaining option: diplomacy, surrender, even the possibility of ruling Egypt under Roman oversight if it meant protecting her children. Messages were sent. Terms were tested. But Octavian had no intention of compromise. Egypt was too valuable, and Cleopatra too symbolic, to be spared as a sovereign ruler. As Roman forces closed in, loyalty fractured. Generals defected. Soldiers deserted. Antony, once unshakable, began to unravel under the weight of failure and isolation. The alliance that had once challenged Rome now struggled simply to survive another day. Cleopatra remained composed. She understood that the war was no longer about victory. It was about legacy. Capture meant humiliation, display, and erasure. Rome did not merely defeat enemies, it turned them into spectacles. Cleopatra knew what awaited her if she was taken alive. When Antony fell, misled by false reports and overwhelmed by despair, the last barrier between Cleopatra and Rome vanished. Alexandria surrendered. Roman troops entered the city not as liberators, but as owners. Cleopatra was taken into custody, but not treated as an ordinary captive. Octavian needed her alive. She was too valuable as a symbol of conquest, too powerful as a warning. Cleopatra understood this instantly. And so, even in captivity, she planned. Her final decision would not be made in panic or weakness. It would be measured, deliberate, and devastating to Rome's narrative. Because while Octavian could conquer Egypt, he could not be allowed to conquer her image. The end was approaching, but Cleopatra intended to choose its terms. Cleopatra's death is one of the most famous and most misunderstood moments in ancient history. Rome preserved the spectacle, but blurred the truth. What survived was a story simple enough to be remembered, dramatic enough to be repeated, and convenient enough to serve the victors. According to the traditional account, Cleopatra chose death by the bite of an asp, a sacred Egyptian symbol associated with royalty and divine protection. The image is powerful, a queen meeting her end on her own terms, wrapped in symbolism, defying Rome to the last breath. But history is rarely that clean. Ancient sources themselves were uncertain. Some spoke of a snake. Others suggested poison concealed in a comb or vial. Still others hinted at a carefully prepared mixture designed to bring death swiftly and quietly. What they all agreed on was this: Cleopatra chose death deliberately. This choice was not an act of despair. It was an act of control. Cleopatra understood what awaited her in Rome. She would be paraded through the streets as a living trophy, stripped of dignity, reduced to proof of Roman dominance. Her death would not end her story, but her survival would allow Rome to rewrite it completely. By dying when she did, Cleopatra denied Octavian his greatest prize. There would be no triumphant display of the Egyptian queen in chains, no final humiliation before the Roman crowd. Instead, Rome was left with absence, an ending it could not fully control. The uncertainty surrounding her death only deepened its power. Whether by snake or poison, the method mattered less than the message. Cleopatra refused to become Rome's property. She refused to let her body, her image, or her legacy be used to validate an empire that feared her even in defeat. What Rome gained was Egypt. What it lost was the ability to fully dominate Cleopatra's narrative. And in that final act, she achieved something extraordinary. Even in death, she remained beyond Rome's grasp. But her story did not end with her final breath. The consequences of her choices would echo through history, especially through the fate of the one person Rome could not afford to let live. Cleopatra's death solved one problem for Rome, but it created another. As long as her son lived, her legacy could not be fully extinguished. Caesarion was not merely a child, he was a symbol, a living reminder of a future that Rome had refused to allow. Octavian understood this better than anyone. Egypt could be annexed, its wealth absorbed, its gods tolerated. But a boy who carried both Ptolemaic blood and a claimed connection to Julius Caesar represented something far more dangerous than rebellion. He represented continuity. For a brief moment, there was uncertainty. Caesarion had been sent away from Alexandria, perhaps in a final attempt by Cleopatra to secure his survival. Some later accounts suggested escape, exile, or a hidden life beyond Rome's reach. But such possibilities did not last. Rome did not hesitate. Caesarion was brought back and executed, quietly and efficiently. There was no public trial, no spectacle, no record of resistance. His death was not celebrated, it was erased. Rome did not want martyrdom. It wanted finality. With Caesarion's execution, something far older than the Roman Republic came to an end. He was the last pharaoh of Egypt in both name and blood, a dynasty that traced its authority back through Alexander the Great and, symbolically, to the gods themselves, ended not in battle, but in silence. For Octavian, the act was necessary. To rule Rome as its undisputed leader, no rival bloodline, real or imagined, could be allowed to exist. Caesarion's death closed that door forever. For Cleopatra, it was the price of her challenge to Rome. And yet, even in this erasure, her defiance endured. Rome could kill the child, but it could not erase the question his existence had posed. What if power had taken a different shape? With Egypt absorbed into the Roman world and its royal line extinguished, the story now passed into the hands of the victors, and they would reshape it to suit themselves. With Cleopatra gone and her bloodline erased, Rome finally controlled Egypt, but control over memory required a different kind of conquest. What followed was not silence, but reshaping. The queen who had negotiated with Rome as an equal could not be remembered as such. She had to be reduced. Roman writers reframed her story to make sense of their victory. Cleopatra became a warning rather than a ruler, an exotic distraction who corrupted Roman virtue and led great men astray. Her political intelligence was recast as manipulation. Her strategic alliances were reduced to affairs. The complexity of her reign was flattened into spectacle. This version of Cleopatra was safer. It reassured Rome that it had not been challenged by a capable sovereign, but merely tempted by excess. The process was deliberate. By turning Cleopatra into a symbol of indulgence and danger, Rome justified its conquest and absolved its leaders of responsibility. Antony was portrayed as not losing a political struggle, but being weakened by a woman. Caesar was depicted as not overreaching, but being ensnared. Cleopatra's power and actions were ignored, and instead, she was judged for being a woman. Over time, repetition hardened distortion into tradition. Poets amplified the drama. Artists exaggerated the luxury. Later cultures inherited Rome's framing and embellished it further. Cleopatra survived in memory, but as a character, not a ruler. Famous, yet misunderstood. And still, the myth never fully settled. Something resisted erasure. The fact that Cleopatra ruled effectively, spoke to her people in their own language, stabilized Egypt, and forced Rome to confront limits it preferred to ignore continued to surface between the lines. Her story refused to stay simple because her life never was. What endured was not Rome's verdict, but the tension it revealed. Cleopatra frightened the ancient world because she proved that power could be intelligent, adaptive, and female without Roman permission. The myths tell us less about who she was and more about what Rome needed her to become. Her afterlife was shaped by her enemies, but it was sustained by her impact. And that is why, centuries later, Cleopatra VII still unsettles history, because the truth beneath the legend was never fully buried. Cleopatra VII was never meant to survive history. Rome conquered her kingdom, erased her bloodline, and reshaped her image until she no longer resembled the woman who ruled Egypt. And yet, she endured, because the truth of her life was too substantial to disappear. She was not the last queen clinging to a dying world. She was a ruler who understood exactly how the world was changing and fought to adapt to it. Cleopatra inherited a collapsing dynasty, a weakened economy, and a superpower circling her borders. She responded not with denial, but with strategy. She learned. She negotiated. She chose her alliances carefully, knowing the risks every time. Her relationships with Rome's leaders were not the cause of her power. They were the tools she used to defend it. When armies failed, she used diplomacy. When diplomacy failed, she used symbolism. And when defeat became inevitable, she made one final choice that denied Rome total victory. That choice is what history still struggles to explain. Cleopatra refused to be displayed, reduced, or rewritten while alive. She chose an ending that preserved her autonomy, even as her kingdom fell. In doing so, she exposed the limits of Roman power. Rome could conquer lands, destroy dynasties, and command armies, but it could not fully control meaning. Egypt became a Roman province. Octavian became Augustus. The empire moved forward, convinced it had settled the matter. But Cleopatra remained, questioning Rome's version of events from the margins of history. What we are left with is not a tragic seductress or a doomed romantic, but a political mind operating at the highest level of the ancient world. A woman who ruled in an age that tried to deny her the right. A queen who forced the greatest empire of antiquity to take her seriously and fear her. And that is why Cleopatra VII still matters. If you've enjoyed uncovering the truth behind one of history's most misunderstood figures, make sure you subscribe to Ancient Odyssey. This is where legends are examined, myths are challenged, and the ancient world speaks beyond the stories we were taught. Because history isn't finished talking if we're willing to listen.